Hey guys, tonight we begin with the history of the New York Yankees. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There's a stillness that settles over baseball in winter, when the diamond lies dormant beneath snow, when the echoes of summer crowds fade into memory. It's in this quiet space that stories begin to breathe again, where the ghosts of the game emerge from the shadows of what was, carrying with them the weight of decades, the texture of legend, the soft whisper of history unfolding like pages in an old, well-worn book. Come with me, if you will, into the cathedral of memory that is Yankee Stadium. Not the gleaming monument that stands today, though it carries its own reverence, but the original house that Ruth built, where the very air seemed thick with the accumulated breath of millions of dreams. Here, in this space between seasons, between heartbeats, we can let the story unfold as it was always meant to be told. Slowly, deliberately, with the patience that only comes from knowing that some truths can only be understood when we allow ourselves to truly listen. The New York Yankees. Even the name carries weight, doesn't it? Like a bell tolling across the harbor of history, each syllable heavy with the accumulated gravity of triumph and tragedy, of dynasty and disappointment, of men who became myths and myths that became eternal. But before they were Yankees, before they were the very definition of baseball royalty, they were something else entirely. The Baltimore Orioles, then the New York Highlanders, a team struggling to find its voice in a city that already had giants. Picture, if you can, the New York of 1903. The city breathes with the rhythm of industrial ambition, steam rising from the streets like the collective exhale of 8 million dreams. The subway system is still a whisper in the planning rooms. The great bridges are new enough to still inspire wonder, and baseball. Baseball is trying to establish itself as something more than a children's game played in vacant lots and farmers' fields. It was in this landscape of possibility that Frank Farrell and Bill Devry, two men whose names history would largely forget, purchased the Baltimore Orioles and moved them to Manhattan. They were not visionaries, these men. They were gamblers, literally and figuratively, betting that New York was large enough for two baseball teams. The Giants had already claimed the island's heart, playing in the shadows of Coogan's Bluff at the Polo Grounds, their presence as established as the cobblestones beneath carriage wheels. But Farrell and Devry had secured Hilltop Park, a wooden structure perched on the highest point of Manhattan, at 168th Street and Broadway. From here, on clear days, you could see across the Hudson River to New Jersey, across the Harlem River to the Bronx, across the very future that none of them could yet imagine. They called their team the Highlanders, a nod to their elevated home, though the newspapers, and with their fondness for brevity and their typesetters' impatience with long words, often shortened it to Yanks. The early years were a study in mediocrity, those first seasons floating by like autumn leaves on an urban stream. Pleasant enough to watch, but ultimately destined for the gutter. The Highlanders were a team of journeymen and has-beens, of players whose names would echo only in the most comprehensive of record books. They finished second in their inaugural season of 1903, which sounds impressive until you realize that it was the American League's early years, when the competition was thin and the stakes were still being established. There was something almost romantic about their futility, the way a struggling artist's garret apartment carries its own peculiar charm. They played before crowds that could fit comfortably in today's restaurants, their cheers and jeers echoing off the wooden grandstands with the hollow sound of possibility unfulfilled. Yet there was something stirring in that struggle, something that spoke to the immigrant soul of New York City itself. The sense that greatness was always just one season away, just one player away, just one moment of magic away from transforming everything. The transformation began, as transformations often do, not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. In 1914, the Highlanders became the Yankees officially, though they'd been called that informally for years. The name change was more than cosmetic. It was a recognition that something was shifting, that the team was beginning to discover its own identity in the great tapestry of New York life. But the real alchemy began 2 years later, when a young left-handed pitcher from St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys in Baltimore signed his first professional contract with the Boston Red Sox. His name was George Herman Ruth, though the world would know him by the diminutive that would become synonymous with baseball itself, Babe. At this moment, in 1914, he was nothing more than a promising young pitcher with a peculiar swing and an appetite for life that seemed to match his considerable frame. The Red Sox, blessed with the kind of short-sighted arrogance that often precedes great falls, sold Ruth to the Yankees in December 1919 for $125,000 and a $300,000 loan that would allow Red Sox owner Harry Frazee to finance his Broadway productions. It was, quite literally, the deal that would curse one franchise and bless another for the better part of a century. Ruth arrived in New York like a force of nature, carrying with him the raw power of American possibility. This was 1920, the dawn of the Roaring Twenties, when the country was shaking off the dust of the Great War and discovering that it had emerged as a world power. The age demanded larger-than-life figures, and Ruth, with his moon-round face, his prodigious appetite, and his ability to hit a baseball farther than anyone had ever imagined possible, was exactly what the moment required. The Yankees of 1920 were still tenants at the Polo Grounds, sharing the stadium with the Giants like poor relations at a family dinner. But Ruth changed everything about their circumstances, everything about their identity, everything about their relationship with the city that was rapidly becoming the center of the world. His first season in pinstripes was a revelation. 54 home runs when the previous record was 29, when most teams didn't hit 54 home runs combined. But it wasn't just the numbers, though the numbers were staggering. It was the way he swung the bat, with the complete commitment of a man diving into a river, not knowing if he would sink or fly. When he connected, the ball didn't just leave the yard, it seemed to enter another realm entirely, disappearing into the afternoon sky like a prayer made tangible. When he missed with such spectacular futility that the crowd gasped with the same awe they reserved for his successes. Ruth was democracy made flesh, the embodiment of the American dream in flannel and leather. He came from nothing, an orphan, essentially, raised by Catholic brothers who saw in him both promise and peril. He ate too much, drank too much, lived too much, and played baseball with a joy so pure and infectious that it transformed not just his team, but the very game itself. In an age when athletes were still largely anonymous figures, Ruth became the first true sports celebrity, his every move chronicled by newspapers, his every home run a national event. The Yankees, feeding off Ruth's magnetism, began to attract other talents. In 1921, they acquired pitcher Waite Hoyt from the Red Sox, another piece of Boston's dismantling that would fuel New York's ascension. They signed Tony Lazzari, the silent second baseman whose steady play would anchor their infield for years to come. They found Lou Gehrig, a young first baseman from Columbia University, whose quiet determination would prove the perfect complement to Ruth's flamboyant genius. But perhaps more importantly, they began to develop an identity, a sense of themselves as something special, something destined. The Yankees of the early 1920s carried themselves with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but it was an arrogance born of ability, seasoned with success, tempered by the knowledge that they were participating in something larger than themselves. In 1923, they opened Yankee Stadium, and if ever a building captured the soul of its inhabitants, it was this cathedral of concrete and steel rising from the marshlands of the Bronx. The stadium was massive by the standards of its day, 58,000 seats when most ballparks held half that number. It was designed specifically to showcase Ruth's power, with a short right field porch that seemed to beckon his home runs like a siren's call. Opening day, April 18, 1923, dawned clear and cool with the kind of crisp spring air that makes every possibility seem within reach. The crowd filled every seat, spilled onto the warning track, created a human amphitheater that stretched beyond the stadium's boundaries. And Ruth, as if understanding that this moment required something transcendent, delivered the first home run in the new stadium's history, a 3-run shot that sailed over the right field wall and into legend. The newspaper the next morning called it the house that Ruth built, and the nickname stuck because it was true in ways that went deeper than architecture. This wasn't just a ballpark. It was a statement, a declaration that the Yankees had arrived not just as competitors, but as the dominant force in American baseball. The stadium's dimensions seemed to bend reality to accommodate Ruth's peculiar talents, its short right field making routine fly balls into home runs, its expansive left field turning doubles into triples for left-handed hitters willing to use the whole field. But stadiums, no matter how magnificent, don't win championships. Teams do. And the Yankees of the mid-1920s were assembling one of the greatest collections of talent in baseball history. Around Ruth's towering presence, they built a roster that read like a who's who of baseball excellence. There was Gehrig, still young and relatively unknown, beginning to establish himself as a power hitter whose consistency would eventually surpass even Ruth's prolific production. There was Tony Lazzari, the second baseman whose quiet competence anchored the infield and whose occasional power outbursts could change the momentum of entire series. The pitching staff was anchored by Waite Hoyt, whose smooth delivery and competitive fire made him the perfect complement to Ruth's offensive fireworks. Hoyt understood that his job wasn't to be the star. It was to keep the games close enough for Ruth and the increasingly powerful Yankees lineup to take over in the late innings. He pitched with the confidence of a man who knew that he had the best offensive team in baseball behind him, and that confidence translated into victories with remarkable consistency. In 1927, they assembled what many still consider the greatest single-season team in baseball history. The 27 Yankees were a collection of talent so deep, so balanced, so perfectly constructed that they seemed less like a baseball team and more like a force of nature, inevitable as the tides, unstoppable as time itself. Ruth, now 32 and at the absolute peak of his considerable powers, embarked on his legendary chase of his own home run record. 60 home runs seemed like an impossible number, more than most teams hit in an entire season. But Ruth attacked the record with the same abandon he brought to everything else in his life, swinging for the fences with every at-bat, playing to the crowds that followed his every move with the devotion usually reserved for religious figures. The chase unfolded throughout the summer like a serial novel, each game bringing new chapters, new developments, new reasons for the nation to hold its collective breath. By September, Ruth was within striking distance, and every Yankees game became a national event. Radio broadcasts carried his at-bats to farms in Kansas, to factories in Detroit, to immigrant neighborhoods in Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia. America was listening. America was watching. America was believing in the possibility of transcendence. On September 30th, 1927, facing Tom Zachary of the Washington Senators, Ruth connected on a 1-1 pitch and sent it sailing into the right field bleachers at Yankee Stadium. 60 home runs. The crowd erupted with a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ballpark, a roar that carried across the Harlem River, across the city, across a nation that had just witnessed something that redefined the possible. But the 27 Yankees were more than just Ruth's record. They were Gehrig, beginning his incredible consecutive games streak and hitting point, 373 with 47 home runs and 175 RBIs, numbers that would have made him the MVP in almost any other season. They were Lazary, driving in 102 runs from the second base position. They were Bob Musil, the left fielder whose line drives could take your head off. They were a collection of talent so deep that their nickname, Murderer's Row, seemed less hyperbolic than simply accurate. They won 110 games that season, a number so staggering that it defied comprehension. They swept the Pittsburgh Pirates in the World Series with such casual efficiency that it seemed almost anticlimactic, like watching a master chess player defeat a child. The series was over almost before it began, the Yankees winning each game with the methodical precision of a machine designed specifically for baseball dominance. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the 27 Yankees wasn't their talent, though their talent was unprecedented, or their success, though their success was overwhelming. It was the way they carried themselves, the sense that they understood they were part of something historic, something that would outlast their individual careers and become part of the permanent record of American achievement. They played with a confidence that bordered on the mystical, as if they knew something the rest of the world was still learning. That excellence, when pursued with complete dedication, becomes its own form of magic. They were professionals in an age when many players still treated baseball as a part-time occupation. Athletes in an era when training consisted mainly of playing catch and taking batting practice. They approached the game with a seriousness and intensity that their opponents couldn't match, and the results spoke for themselves with thunderous clarity. The late 1920s and early 1930s were the Yankees' first golden age, a period when winning seemed as natural as breathing, when championships accumulated like autumn leaves in Central Park. They won the World Series again in 1928, sweeping the Cardinals with the same ruthless efficiency they'd shown against Pittsburgh. Ruth and Gehrig were both at their peaks, their offensive production so prolific that pitchers often seemed to be choosing which form of destruction they preferred. Ruth's towering home runs, or Gehrig's line drive doubles that could clear the bases in a single swing. But even in the midst of this unprecedented success, time was beginning to whisper its inevitable truths. Ruth, though still productive, was showing signs of his age and his lifestyle. His home run totals, while still impressive, were no longer record-setting. His speed, never his greatest asset, had diminished to the point where routine grounders sometimes became close plays at first base. The man who had redefined what was possible in baseball was discovering, like all great athletes eventually discover, that the body has its own schedule, its own limits, its own quiet insistence on mortality. Gehrig, meanwhile, was ascending to his own form of greatness. The quiet first baseman, who had lived in Ruth's shadow for most of his career, was beginning to emerge as a star in his own right. His consecutive games streak, which had begun almost accidentally in 1925 when he pinch hit for Pee Wee Waninger, had grown into something approaching mythology. Day after day, season after season, Gehrig took the field with the reliability of sunrise, his presence as certain as the bases were 90 feet apart. There was something almost Calvinist about Gehrig's approach to baseball, the sense that excellence was not just a goal, but a moral obligation, that showing up was not just a choice, but a sacred duty. He played through injuries that would sideline lesser players, played through personal tragedies that would break other men's spirits, played with a consistency that seemed to mock the very concept of human frailty. In 1932, Ruth and Gehrig led the Yankees to another World Series championship, this one notable for Ruth's alleged called shot in Game 3 against the Cubs at Wrigley Field. Whether Ruth actually pointed to the center field bleachers before hitting his home run remains one of baseball's most debated moments, a question that has generated more speculation than the Kennedy assassination, and less consensus than the weather forecast. What's not debatable is that Ruth, facing a hostile Chicago crowd that had been riding him mercilessly, stepped into the batter's box with the kind of theatrical confidence that had defined his entire career. The count ran to 2 balls, 2 strikes, a moment of maximum tension, maximum possibility. Charlie Root delivered his pitch. Ruth swung with that familiar violent beauty that had captivated the nation for more than a decade, and the ball soared over the center field wall like a period at the end of a perfectly constructed sentence. Did he call it? The question misses the larger point. Ruth had been calling his shots in one way or another for his entire career. Every time he stepped to the plate, he was announcing his intention to do something extraordinary. Every swing carried with it the implicit promise that the impossible was merely improbable, that the laws of physics were more like suggestions than absolute rules. But by 1934, Ruth's time as a Yankee was ending. His skills had eroded to the point where his legendary pride, the same pride that had fueled his greatest achievements, could no longer ignore the evidence of his decline. The Yankees, with the cold calculation that would characterize their approach to personnel decisions for decades to come, released him after the season. He signed with the Boston Braves, hoping for one final moment of glory, but found instead only the painful reminder that time is undefeated in its contests with human ambition. Ruth's departure from the Yankees marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of another. Gehrig, no longer playing in the shadow of baseball's greatest star, emerged as the team's undisputed leader. His 1934 season was a masterpiece of sustained excellence. A .363 batting average, 49 home runs, 165 RBIs, and the Triple Crown that formally announced his ascension to the top of the baseball hierarchy. But even as Gehrig was reaching his peak, the Yankees were preparing for their next dynasty. In the minor leagues, a young outfielder from San Francisco was developing the skills that would soon make him the most famous athlete in America. His name was Joe DiMaggio, and his arrival in New York in 1936 would usher in the Yankees' second golden age. DiMaggio was everything Ruth wasn't: quiet where Ruth was boisterous, elegant where Ruth was crude, controlled where Ruth was spontaneous. But like Ruth, he possessed that indefinable quality that separated great players from immortal ones. He played the game with a grace that seemed almost balletic, his movements economical and precise, his presence on the field commanding without being ostentatious. His rookie season of 1936 was a revelation. Playing right field in Yankee Stadium, he hit 323 with 29 home runs and 125 RBIs, numbers that would have been impressive for a veteran, remarkable for a rookie, and extraordinary for a player who was still learning how to handle the pressures of playing in New York. But it wasn't just the statistics that announced DiMaggio's arrival. It was the way he carried himself, the sense that he understood instinctively what it meant to be a Yankee. The Yankees of the late 1930s, built around the partnership of Gehrig and DiMaggio, were a different kind of dominant than their predecessors. Where the Ruth-era teams had relied on overwhelming offensive power, these Yankees were more balanced, more complete, more professional in their approach to every aspect of the game. They had excellent pitching, anchored by Red Ruffing and Lefty Gomez, both of whom understood that their job was to keep games close enough for the offense to take over in the late innings. They had solid defense, with Gehrig providing steady excellence at first base and DiMaggio covering center field with a combination of speed instincts and positioning that made routine flies look easy and difficult catches look routine. They had depth throughout the lineup. Players like Bill Dickey behind the plate, Tony Lazzari at second base, and Red Rolfe at third base, all of whom could contribute both offensively and defensively. Most importantly, they had what baseball people call championship mettle, the ability to perform at their best when the stakes were highest. In 1936, they won the World Series, defeating the Giants in 6 games in the first Subway Series since 1922. In 1937, they repeated as champions, this time defeating the Giants in 5 games. In 1938, they swept the Cubs, their 4th championship in 6 years. But it was in 1939 that the Yankees reached what many consider their absolute peak, even as they faced the most heartbreaking chapter in their history. Gehrig, the Iron Horse, the man who had played in 2,130 consecutive games, began to show signs of the disease that would eventually claim his life. His reflexes, once sharp as a jeweler's tools, had slowed perceptibly. His power, which had been the constant of his career, had diminished to the point where routine fly balls were staying in the park. On May 2, 1939, Gehrig removed himself from the lineup, ending his consecutive games streak and beginning the final chapter of one of baseball's most tragic stories. The diagnosis, when it came, was amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, now known as Lou Gehrig's disease, though Gehrig himself would never live to see his name attached to the condition that killed him. On July 4, 1939, the Yankees held Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day at Yankee Stadium. Between games of a doubleheader against the Washington Senators, Gehrig walked slowly to the microphone at home plate, his body already showing the effects of the disease that was consuming him from within. The crowd of 61,808 rose as one, their applause thunderous and sustained, a sound that seemed to carry with it all the love and admiration that a city could hold for one man. And then Gehrig spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the stadium, across the radio waves, across the decades to us. Fans, for the past 2 weeks, you have been reading about the bad break I got. Yet today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. The words have been quoted so often that they've almost lost their power to move us. But in that moment, in that place, they represented something profound about the human spirit's capacity to find grace in the face of unthinkable tragedy. Here was a man facing his own mortality, acknowledging his fate while simultaneously declaring his gratitude for the life he'd been given. It was American optimism distilled to its purest essence, the belief that even in the darkest moments, there is still reason for hope. The 1939 Yankees, playing with the weight of Gehrig's tragedy on their shoulders, responded by putting together one of the greatest seasons in baseball history. They won 106 games and swept the Cincinnati Reds in the World Series, their fourth consecutive championship, a feat that wouldn't be matched until they did it again in the early 1950s. DiMaggio, now the undisputed star of the team, had his best season to date, hitting .381 with 30 home runs and 126 RBIs. But more than the statistics, he provided leadership, the kind of quiet, confident presence that great teams require. He never tried to replace Gehrig. No one could have done that. But he established himself as the team's emotional center, the player around whom everything else revolved. The Yankees entered the 1940s as the most successful franchise in professional sports, winners of 5 World Series in 7 years, possessors of a mystique that seemed to make victory inevitable. But even dynasties face challenges. Even the greatest teams must eventually confront the reality that excellence is temporary, that dominance is always under threat from younger, hungrier competitors. The challenge came from an unexpected source, not another team, but world events that would reshape American life and, by extension, American baseball. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, plunging the United States into World War II and creating circumstances that would test every institution in American society, including the New York Yankees. The war years presented the Yankees, like every other baseball team, with unprecedented challenges. DiMaggio enlisted in the Army Air Forces, trading his Yankees pinstripes for military fatigues, his bat for the tools of war. Other key players followed suit. Phil Rizzuto, Jerry Coleman, Yogi Berra all left baseball to serve their country, their careers interrupted by duty to something larger than themselves. The Yankees, who remained, played before smaller crowds, in stadiums where the lights were dimmed to conserve energy, in a country where baseball seemed both more important and less important than it had ever been. More important because it provided a connection to normalcy, a reminder of what American life could be like when the shooting stopped. Less important because real young men were dying in places with names most Americans had never heard, fighting for principles that made baseball games seem trivial by comparison. The team managed to win the World Series in 1943, defeating the Cardinals in 5 games, but it felt different somehow, like an echo of their former greatness rather than greatness itself. The players were different. Older men past their prime, younger men not yet ready, replacement players who understood that they were placeholders until the real Yankees returned from overseas. But perhaps the most significant development during the war years wasn't what happened on the field, but what happened in the front office. In 1944, Larry MacPhail, Dan Topping, and Del Webb purchased the Yankees from the estate of Jacob Ruppert, bringing new energy and new vision to the franchise. MacPhail, in particular, was a promotional genius who understood that baseball was as much about entertainment as it was about athletics. Under MacPhail's guidance, the Yankees began to modernize their approach to the business of baseball. They installed lights for night games, improved the stadium's amenities, and began to market themselves more aggressively to New York's increasingly diverse population. They understood, perhaps better than any other franchise, that success on the field was only one component of long-term prosperity. When the war ended and the players returned, the Yankees were positioned to begin their greatest dynasty. DiMaggio came back from military service older, and perhaps a step slower, but still magnificent, still capable of moments that defied rational explanation. In 1947, he would put together one of baseball's most celebrated achievements, a 56-game hitting streak that captured the nation's attention in ways that seem almost impossible to imagine in our fragmented media landscape. The streak began inauspiciously enough, with a single off Edgar Smith of the Chicago White Sox on May 15, 1947. For the first few weeks, no one paid much attention. Hitting streaks come and go, and even the greatest players have hot and cold stretches. But as May turned to June, and June progressed toward July, and DiMaggio continued to get at least one hit in every game, the streak began to take on a life of its own. Baseball, perhaps more than any other sport, lends itself to these kinds of sustained narratives. The daily nature of the game, the accumulation of at-bats and opportunities, creates possibilities for achievements that unfold over time like chapters in a novel. DiMaggio's streak became a national obsession, a daily drama that played out in newspapers and on radio broadcasts across the country. By the time the streak reached 40 games, DiMaggio was front-page news. People who couldn't tell you the difference between a curveball and a changeup were following his daily quest for hits with the intensity usually reserved for elections or wars. The pressure was enormous. Every at-bat carried with it the weight of history, the knowledge that millions of people were watching, waiting to see if this remarkable run would continue for one more day. On July 17, 1947, facing the Cleveland Indians at Municipal Stadium, DiMaggio's streak finally ended at 56 games. Third baseman Ken Keltner made two spectacular defensive plays to rob DiMaggio of hits, and the streak was over, leaving behind a record that has never been seriously challenged and likely never will be. But the streak was more than just a statistical achievement. It was a moment when individual excellence transcended sports and became part of the larger American narrative. DiMaggio, with his quiet dignity and consistent performance, embodied the kind of steady excellence that the country needed in the post-war years. He was a symbol of reliability in an uncertain world, proof that some things could still be counted on, that not everything was subject to the chaos that seemed to define modern life. The late 1940s Yankees were built around DiMaggio's star power, but they were also deeper and more talented than any team the franchise had ever assembled. Casey Stengel, who took over as manager in 1949, brought a combination of baseball wisdom and personal eccentricity that perfectly matched the team's needs. Stengel was a student of the game who understood that managing wasn't just about making out lineup cards. It was about psychology, about getting the most out of talented individuals while welding them into a cohesive unit. Under Stengel's guidance, the Yankees developed a platoon system that maximized the strengths of their players while minimizing their weaknesses. He mixed and matched lineups based on matchups, situations, and even hunches, creating a fluid approach to roster management that kept opponents guessing and players fresh. The 1949 season epitomized everything that made the Stengel Yankees special. DiMaggio missed the first half of the season with a heel injury, but when he returned in late June, He did so with a series of performances that seemed almost scripted for maximum drama. In his first 3 games back, all against the Boston Red Sox at Fenway Park, he hit 4 home runs and drove in 9 runs, single-handedly turning around both the series and the Yankees' season. The 1949 pennant race came down to the final 2 games of the season, with the Yankees and Red Sox tied for first place. The 2 teams met at Yankee Stadium in a winner-take-all showdown that had all the drama of a heavyweight championship fight. The Yankees won both games, claiming the pennant on the final day of the season and beginning what would become their most dominant period. From 1949 to 1953, the Yankees won 5 consecutive World Series championships, a feat unparalleled in professional sports. They did it with a combination of veteran leadership and young talent, of proven stars and emerging players, of systematic excellence that made winning look almost effortless. DiMaggio retired after the 1951 season, going out on top after the Yankees' 3rd straight championship. His final moment as a Yankee was a ground ball to second base in Game 6 of the World Series against the Giants, a routine play that ended both the game and one of the greatest careers in baseball history. He walked off the field knowing that he had given everything he had to give, that his legacy was secure, that he had been part of something larger and more lasting than individual achievement. But even as DiMaggio was leaving, the Yankees were preparing for their next phase. In center field, taking over DiMaggio's position and, in many ways, his role as the face of the franchise, was a young player from Oklahoma whose combination of power, speed, and charisma would define baseball in the 1950s and early 1960s. His name was Mickey Mantle, and his arrival marked the beginning of the Yankees' longest and most successful dynasty. Mantle was raw talent incarnate, a player whose physical gifts seemed almost supernatural. He could hit home runs from either side of the plate with equal power, run from home to first base in under 4 seconds, and throw a baseball from center field to home plate with accuracy and velocity that left coaches speechless. He was, in the words of one scout, what God would look like if God played baseball. But Mantle was also deeply human, subject to injuries and insecurities that would plague him throughout his career. His knees, damaged in high school football and made worse by a drain cover accident during the 1951 World Series, would never be completely healthy. He played his entire career in pain, taking cortisone shots and pain medication just to take the field, his natural abilities constantly at war with his body's limitations. The Yankees of the 1950s, built around Mantle's prodigious talent and Stengel's strategic genius, were perhaps the most complete team in baseball history. They had everything: power hitting from Mantle, Yogi Berra, and Hank Bauer, pitching depth with Whitey Ford, Allie Reynolds, and Eddie Lopat, defensive excellence throughout the lineup, and a bench so deep that their reserves could have started for most other teams. Yogi Berra, the team's catcher and unofficial philosopher, embodied the Yankees' approach to winning better than anyone. He was, in the words of his famous malapropisms, 90% mental and the other half physical, a player who understood that baseball was as much about thinking as it was about athletic ability. Behind the plate, he was a master tactician, calling pitches with an intuitive understanding of hitters' weaknesses and his own pitcher's strengths. But it was Berra's approach to clutch situations that truly set him apart. In pressure moments, when other players might tense up or overthink, Berra simply played baseball. He had an uncanny ability to get hits when the team needed them most, to call the right pitch in crucial situations, to provide the steady leadership that great teams require. Whitey Ford, the team's ace left-hander, was cut from similar cloth. He pitched with the confidence of a man who knew he had the best team in baseball behind him, but he never took that support for granted. Ford understood that his job was to keep games close enough for the Yankees' offense to take over, and he approached every start with the methodical precision of a surgeon. Ford's signature pitch was a slider that seemed to disappear just as it reached home plate, leaving hitters swinging at air or hitting weak ground balls to the infield. But his greatest asset wasn't any single pitch. It was his intelligence, his ability to read hitters and adjust his approach based on the situation. He pitched like a chess master, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always looking for the subtle advantage that would tip the balance in his favor. The 1956 season produced one of the most remarkable individual performances in World Series history, when Don Larson threw a perfect game in Game 5 against the Brooklyn Dodgers. Larson was an unlikely hero, a journeyman pitcher with a mediocre regular season record, a player who might have been forgotten entirely if not for one magical afternoon in October. The perfect game unfolded with the kind of mounting tension that makes baseball unique among sports. As the innings progressed, and no Dodger reached base, the crowd at Yankee Stadium grew quieter and more tense, afraid that any noise might somehow break the spell. By the 7th inning, even the Yankees' dugout had fallen silent, following the superstition that talking about a no-hitter in progress would somehow jinx it. Dale Mitchell, pinch hitting for the Dodgers in the 9th inning, took a called third strike to complete the perfect game. And Yogi Berra's leap into Larson's arms became one of the most iconic images in sports history. It was a moment of pure joy, unscripted and spontaneous, that it captured everything wonderful about baseball. The possibility that on any given day something extraordinary might happen, something that had never happened before and might never happen again. The Yankees won that World Series in 7 games, but more importantly, they had given the baseball world a perfect game in the World Series, an achievement so rare and magnificent that it seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of athletic competition, in that realm where sport transcends itself and becomes art. By the late 1950s, the Yankees had established themselves as more than just a successful baseball team. They had become an American institution, as much a part of the national landscape as the Statue of Liberty or the Golden Gate Bridge. Their success was so consistent, so seemingly inevitable, that other teams measured themselves not by whether they could beat the Yankees, but by how competitive they could be against them. But even dynasties must eventually face their mortality, and the Yankees of the early 1960s were beginning to show signs of age and complacency. Stengel, now in his 70s, was fired after the 1960 World Series loss to Pittsburgh, a shocking upset that seemed to announce that the baseball world was changing, that the old certainties could no longer be taken for granted. The transition to the 1960s brought new challenges and new opportunities. Ralph Houck took over as manager, bringing a more modern approach to handling players and a fresh perspective on strategy. Mantle, despite his chronic injuries, was entering what many consider his greatest period, the early 1960s, when his combination of power and speed made him arguably the most feared hitter in baseball. In 1961, the baseball world focused its attention on the chase for Babe Ruth's home run record. Both Mantle and his teammate Roger Maris were on pace to break Ruth's mark of 60 home runs, setting up one of the most fascinating individual competitions in sports history. The nation was captivated by the daily drama of the home run chase, with newspapers tracking every at-bat, every swing, every missed opportunity. Maris, a quiet outfielder who had been acquired from Kansas City before the 1960 season, found himself thrust into a spotlight that he neither sought nor particularly enjoyed. He was a private man who preferred to let his performance speak for itself, but the pursuit of Ruth's record made privacy impossible. Every day brought new interviews, new questions, new pressures that had nothing to do with simply playing baseball. Mantle, the more natural showman and the crowd favorite, seemed better equipped to handle the attention, but his body betrayed him at the crucial moment. An injury in September effectively ended his pursuit of the record, leaving Maris to chase Ruth's ghost alone. The pressure was enormous, not just the statistical pressure of reaching 61 home runs, but the cultural pressure of breaking a record that many considered sacred. Ruth's 60 home runs wasn't just a number. It was a symbol of an era, a reminder of a time when baseball was simpler, when heroes were larger than life, when individual achievement could capture the imagination of an entire nation. To break that record was to challenge not just a statistical mark, but a piece of American mythology. Maris approached the challenge with the same workmanlike attitude he brought to every aspect of his game. He didn't swagger or showboat, or make grand pronouncements about his place in history. He simply showed up every day and tried to hit the baseball as hard and as far as he could, letting the numbers accumulate naturally, organically, without forced drama or artificial excitement. On October 1st, 1961, the final day of the regular season, Maris hit his 61st home run off Tracy Stallard of the Boston Red Sox. The ball sailed into the right field bleachers at Yankee Stadium, and history was made. Not with the thunderous approval that had greeted Ruth's achievements, but with a mixture of awe and ambivalence that reflected the complicated feelings many fans had about seeing a beloved record broken. The home run was both a triumph and a burden for Maris. He had achieved something that no player had ever achieved, but he had also inherited the weight of comparison to Ruth that would follow him for the rest of his career. He had broken the most famous record in baseball, but he had done so in a season that was 8 games longer than Ruth's 1927 campaign, a fact that Commissioner Ford Frick acknowledged by placing an asterisk next to the record in the official record books. The 1961 Yankees, powered by the Maris-Mantle combination and supported by one of the deepest lineups in baseball history, won 109 games and swept the Cincinnati Reds in the World Series. They were a machine of almost mechanical efficiency, winning with the kind of systematic dominance that made victory seem like a foregone conclusion. But beneath the surface of this success, changes were stirring that would eventually challenge the Yankees' supremacy. The game itself was evolving, with expansion diluting the talent pool and creating new opportunities for previously unsuccessful franchises. The business of baseball was changing, with television revenues and marketing opportunities creating new sources of income and new pressures for entertainment value. More significantly, American society was changing in ways that made the Yankees' conservative, establishment image seem increasingly out of step with the times. The 1960s were a decade of rebellion and questioning, of challenges to authority and conventional wisdom. The Yankees, with their corporate efficiency and unquestioning hierarchy, represented exactly the kind of institution that the counterculture was rebelling against. The team continued to win through the mid-1960s, capturing World Series championships in 1962 and 1963. but there were signs that their dominance was becoming more difficult to maintain. Other teams were catching up, both in terms of talent and in terms of organizational sophistication. The Yankees' farm system, which had been their greatest advantage for decades, was no longer producing the steady stream of talent that had fueled their success. In 1964, they won their fifth consecutive American League pennant, but lost the World Series to the St. Louis Cardinals in 7 games, a defeat that seemed to signal the end of an era. The following season, they finished 6th in the American League, their first losing season since 1925. And suddenly, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the franchise for 4 decades seemed to evaporate like morning mist. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of wandering in the wilderness for the Yankees, a time when the franchise that had defined excellence in professional sports struggled to find its identity in a changing world. Mantle retired after the 1968 season, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of nearly 2 decades of playing through pain. His farewell was both an ending and a reminder of what had been lost. Not just a great player, but a connection to the Yankees' golden age. The team moved through a succession of managers and general managers, searching for the formula that would restore their championship tradition. They made trades that didn't work out, signed free agents who failed to live up to expectations, drafted players who never developed into the stars they were projected to become. For the first time in their history, the Yankees seemed ordinary, just another team struggling to compete in an increasingly competitive league. But even in their darkest period, the foundation for their next revival was being laid. George Steinbrenner purchased the team in 1973, bringing with him the kind of ambitious vision and unlimited financial resources that the franchise needed to reclaim its position at the top of the baseball hierarchy. Steinbrenner was a controversial figure, demanding, impatient, willing to spend whatever it took to win. But he was also exactly what the Yankees needed to shake off the complacency that had settled over the organization. Under Steinbrenner's ownership, the Yankees began to rebuild with the same systematic approach that had made them successful in earlier eras. They invested heavily in their farm system, hired the best scouts and coaches money could buy, and began to pursue the top free agents with an aggressiveness that other teams couldn't match. The breakthrough came in the mid-1970s, when a new generation of Yankees stars began to emerge. Thurman Munson, the team's fiery catcher and captain, embodied the kind of competitive spirit that had been missing from the organization for years. Ron Guidry, a left-handed pitcher from Louisiana, developed into one of the most dominant hurlers in the game. Reggie Jackson, acquired in a blockbuster trade from Oakland, brought the kind of star power and clutch performance that the Yankees had been lacking. But perhaps the most significant addition was Billy Martin, who returned to the Yankees as manager in 1975. Martin had been a scrappy second baseman on the great Yankees teams of the 1950s, and he brought with him an intimate understanding of what it meant to be a Yankee, what it took to win championships, what standards the organization needed to maintain. Martin was a complex figure, brilliant as a strategist, fierce as a competitor, but also volatile and unpredictable, capable of both inspiring his players to extraordinary achievements and alienating them with his demanding personality. His relationship with Steinbrenner was equally complicated, a partnership built on mutual respect for each other's baseball knowledge and mutual frustration with each other's methods. The 1976 Yankees won their first American League pennant since 1964, though they lost the World Series to Cincinnati's Big Red Machine in 4 games. But the foundation had been established. The culture of winning had been restored, and the stage was set for one of the most dramatic and successful periods in franchise history. The 1977 season brought Reggie Jackson to New York, along with all the expectations and controversy that surrounded one of baseball's most polarizing superstars. Jackson was a player who understood that baseball was entertainment as much as athletics, who embraced the spotlight and the pressure that came with playing in New York. He was exactly the kind of larger-than-life personality that the Yankees had been missing, and exactly the kind of ego that was destined to clash with Billy Martin's authoritarian management style. The tension between Jackson and Martin became the dominant storyline of the 1977 season, a soap opera that played out in the tabloid newspapers and on television screens across the country. They argued about batting order, about defensive positioning, about fundamental questions of respect and authority that went to the heart of what it meant to be part of a team. But when the pressure was highest, when the lights were brightest, when the stakes were greatest, Jackson performed with the kind of clutch excellence that defines legendary players. In Game 6 of the 1977 World Series against the Los Angeles Dodgers, with the Yankees leading the series 3-2, Jackson hit 3 home runs on 3 consecutive pitches from 3 different pitchers, each blast traveling farther than the last, each swing more emphatic than the previous one. The performance was vintage Jackson, theatrical, dramatic, almost impossibly clutch. It was also vintage Yankees, finding a way to win when winning mattered most, rising to the occasion when the championship was on the line. Jackson's 3 home runs clinched the World Series and earned him the nickname Mr. October, a moniker that perfectly captured his ability to perform his best when the stakes were highest. The Yankees repeated as champions in 1978, this time overcoming a 14-game deficit to the Boston Red Sox to win the American League East, then defeating the Red Sox in a 1-game playoff that many consider the greatest single game in baseball history. Bucky Dent's home run over the Green Monster in Fenway Park was one of those moments that seemed to defy probability. A routine fly ball that caught just enough wind to clear the wall and break the hearts of Red Sox fans everywhere. But even as the Yankees were celebrating their return to championship form, the seeds of future turmoil were being sown. Martin's relationship with Steinbrenner had deteriorated to the point where communication between them was virtually impossible. Jackson's contract was expiring, and his future with the team was uncertain. The baseball landscape was changing, with free agency creating new opportunities for player movement and new challenges for building and maintaining championship teams. The early 1980s brought a new set of challenges and opportunities for the Yankees. Don Mattingly emerged as one of the game's premier first basemen, a player whose combination of hitting ability and defensive excellence reminded longtime fans of Lou Gehrig. Dave Winfield signed as a free agent, bringing with him the kind of all-around excellence that the Yankees had always prized. But despite the individual talent, championships proved elusive. The Yankees reached the World Series in 1981, losing to the Dodgers in 6 games, but they wouldn't return to the series again until 1996. The 1980s and early 1990s were a period of frustration for a franchise accustomed to measuring success in championships rather than individual achievements. The problem wasn't a lack of talent. The Yankees consistently fielded competitive teams with star players and solid supporting casts. The problem was that baseball had become more competitive, with better scouting, better training, better management throughout the league. The advantages that had made the Yankees dominant for so many decades, superior financial resources, better organizational structure, more attractive destination for free agents, were no longer enough to guarantee success. Steinbrenner's impatience with anything less than championships led to a constant turnover of managers and executives, creating an atmosphere of instability that made it difficult to build the kind of cohesive team chemistry that championship clubs require. Players arrived and departed with bewildering frequency, preventing the development of the long-term relationships and shared experiences that had characterized the great Yankees teams of the past. But beneath the surface turmoil, the foundation for the next dynasty was slowly being assembled. The Yankees invested heavily in their farm system, developing a new generation of homegrown talent that would eventually form the core of their championship teams. They hired Joe Torre as manager in 1996, bringing in a leader whose calm demeanor and vast experience provided the stability that the organization had been lacking. Most importantly, they began to understand that building a championship team required more than just acquiring the best individual players. It required creating a culture, an identity, a shared commitment to excellence that went beyond individual statistics or personal achievements. The 1996 season marked the beginning of the Yankees' modern dynasty. Their return to championship form after an 18-year drought that had seemed to last a lifetime for fans accustomed to regular October celebrations. The team that Torre inherited was a mixture of veteran leadership and young talent, of proven stars and emerging players, of the kind of depth and balance that great teams require. Derek Jeter, a rookie shortstop from Kalamazoo, Michigan, embodied everything that the Yankees hoped to become. He played with the kind of quiet confidence and clutch performance that had characterized the franchise's greatest players, but he also brought a modern sensibility, an understanding of media and marketing that made him perfect for playing in New York at the end of the 20th century. Bernie Williams, the center fielder whose smooth swing and guitar playing made him a fan favorite, provided the kind of consistent offensive production that championship teams require. Tino Martinez, acquired to replace the aging Don Mattingly at first base, brought power and reliability to the middle of the lineup. But perhaps the most important addition was Mariano Rivera, a slight right-handed reliever whose cut fastball would eventually make him the greatest closer in baseball history. Rivera pitched with the kind of calm composure that seemed almost supernatural, entering the game in the most pressure-packed situations with the demeanor of a man taking a leisurely stroll through the park. The 1996 World Series against the Atlanta Braves was a 6-game thriller that announced the Yankees' return to championship form. They lost the first 2 games at home, falling behind to a Braves team that many considered superior in every aspect of the game. But they won all 3 games in Atlanta, then clinched the championship at home in Game 6, celebrating their first World Series title since 1978. The celebration that followed was both joyous and cathartic, a release of 18 years of frustration and disappointment, a reminder of what it felt like to be Yankees again. The parade through the Canyon of Heroes drew millions of fans, creating a river of pinstripes that flowed through lower Manhattan like a tide of pure happiness. But the 1996 championship was just the beginning. The Yankees of the late 1990s were building something special, something that would eventually be recognized as one of the greatest dynasties in the history of professional sports. They won the World Series again in 1998, this time winning 114 regular season games and sweeping the San Diego Padres in the series, a display of dominance that reminded longtime observers of the great Yankees teams of the past. The 1998 team was particularly remarkable for its balance and depth. They didn't have a single player who led the league in any major offensive category, but they had 9 players who drove in at least 70 runs. They didn't have a pitcher who won 20 games, but they had a rotation that was deep and reliable, anchored by David Cone, Andy Pettitte, and David Wells. Wells provided one of the season's most memorable moments when he threw a perfect game against the Minnesota Twins on May 17th, becoming just the 15th pitcher in baseball history to achieve perfection. The performance was vintage Wells, crafty, competitive, and slightly unconventional, thrown by a pitcher who looked more like a weekend softball player than a professional athlete. The Yankees repeated as champions in 1999, sweeping the Braves in a World Series that seemed almost anticlimactic after the drama of their previous 2 championships. They had established themselves as the dominant force in baseball, winning with a combination of individual talent and team chemistry that made their success seem both inevitable and effortless. But it was the 2000 championship that truly cemented their place in baseball history. The Subway Series against the New York Mets was the first all-New York World Series since 1956, creating a citywide celebration of baseball that transcended individual team loyalties. The series went 5 games, with the Yankees winning in a fashion that perfectly captured their championship mystique. Not with overwhelming displays of power, but with timely hitting, excellent pitching, and the kind of clutch performance that had defined their greatest teams. By winning 4 championships in 5 years, the Yankees had established themselves as a modern dynasty, worthy of comparison with the great teams of their past. They had done it in an era of increased competition, with free agency and revenue sharing, making it more difficult than ever for any single team to maintain sustained excellence. But perhaps more importantly, they had restored the culture of winning that had defined the franchise for most of its history. Young players like Jeter, Rivera, Petita, and Jorge Posada had learned what it meant to be Yankees, had absorbed the lessons of their predecessors, had become the latest links in a chain of excellence that stretched back to Ruth and Gehrig and DiMaggio. The early 2000s brought new challenges as the core players aged and younger teams began to challenge the Yankees' supremacy. They reached the World Series in 2001 and 2003, losing both times in dramatic fashion that reminded fans that even the greatest teams are subject to the vagaries of October baseball. The 2001 World Series against the Arizona Diamondbacks was particularly heartbreaking, with the Yankees losing in 7 games, despite leading in the 9th inning of Game 7. It was the kind of defeat that would have crushed lesser organizations, but the Yankees responded with the resilience that had always characterized their greatest teams. The 2004 American League Championship Series against the Boston Red Sox provided one of the most dramatic collapses in baseball history, with the Yankees blowing a 3-0 series lead to their most bitter rivals. The defeat was devastating, not just because of what it meant for that particular season, but because of what it represented: the end of an era, the beginning of a new period of uncertainty and challenge. But even in defeat, the Yankees maintained their commitment to excellence, their belief that championships were not just goals, but expectations, that success was not just hoped for, but demanded. They continued to pursue the best players, to invest in their organization, to maintain the standards that had made them the most successful franchise in professional sports. The late 2000s brought new stars and new challenges. Alex Rodriguez joined the team in 2004, bringing with him both immense talent and considerable controversy. His relationship with the fans, the media, and his teammates was complicated from the beginning, shaped by his enormous contract, his previous comments about the Yankees, and the pressure that came with trying to fill the shoes of Derek Jeter. Rodriguez was undeniably talented, one of the greatest players of his generation, a shortstop with unprecedented power who could carry a team single-handedly when he was at his best. But he was also a player who seemed to shrink in the biggest moments, whose performance in the playoffs never quite matched his regular season excellence. The Yankees' pursuit of Rodriguez was characteristic of their approach during this period. Aggressive, expensive, focused on acquiring the best available talent regardless of cost or complications. It was an approach that brought them considerable success in the regular season, but left them frustrated in October, winning just one championship between 2001 and 2009. But in 2009, everything came together in a way that reminded fans why the Yankees had become synonymous with championship baseball. The team that year was a perfect blend of veteran leadership and young talent, of proven stars and emerging players, of the kind of depth and chemistry that great teams require. Jeter, now in his mid-30s, continued to provide the kind of steady leadership and clutch performance that had defined his career. Rivera, seemingly ageless in his late 30s, remained the most dominant closer in baseball. Rodriguez, finally freed from some of the pressure that had surrounded him, had his best postseason performance, hitting clutch home runs and driving in crucial runs. The 2009 World Series against the Philadelphia Phillies was a 6-game series that showcased everything that made the Yankees special. They won with timely hitting, excellent pitching, smart base running, and the kind of situational awareness that comes from years of playing meaningful games in October. The championship was particularly satisfying because it came in the first year of the new Yankee Stadium, a magnificent facility that honored the franchise's history while providing state-of-the-art amenities for players and fans. The new stadium was controversial among some longtime fans who preferred the intimacy and history of the original, but it was also a statement of the organization's commitment to maintaining its position at the forefront of professional baseball. The celebration that followed the 2009 championship was both familiar and fresh. Another parade through the Canyon of Heroes, another opportunity for the city to celebrate its most successful sports franchise. But it was also tinged with the knowledge that this might be the end of an era, that the core players who had brought the Yankees 4 championships in 5 years were aging. That change was inevitable. Indeed, the 2010s would prove to be a period of transition for the Yankees, a time when the franchise struggled to maintain its championship standard while developing the next generation of stars. They remained competitive, reaching the playoffs regularly, and maintaining their status as one of baseball's elite organizations. But championships proved elusive. The retirement of longtime stars like Rivera, Petit, and eventually Jeter marked the end of an era that had defined Yankees baseball for nearly 2 decades. These players had embodied everything that the franchise stood for: excellence, professionalism, clutch performance, and an unwavering commitment to winning. Jeter's final game at Yankee Stadium in September 2014 was a perfect encapsulation of his career and his relationship with the fans. Facing the Baltimore Orioles in a meaningless late-season game, he delivered a walk-off hit in the bottom of the 9th inning, providing one last moment of magic for the fans who had watched him grow from a rookie into a legend. The moment was pure theater, the kind of storybook ending that seemed almost too perfect to be real. But it was also vintage Jeter. Clutch, professional, and perfectly timed. It reminded everyone watching why he had become synonymous with Yankees baseball, why his number would hang in Monument Park alongside the greatest players in franchise history. As the Yankees moved into the second decade of the 21st century, they faced new challenges and new opportunities. The game of baseball was evolving, with analytics and advanced statistics playing an increasingly important role in player evaluation and strategic decision-making. The business of baseball was changing, with new revenue streams and marketing opportunities creating both possibilities and pressures. But through all the changes, the Yankees maintained their commitment to the principles that had made them successful for more than a century. The pursuit of excellence, the expectation of championships, the understanding that wearing pinstripes carries with it both privileges and responsibilities. Young stars like Aaron Judge and Gleyber Torres emerged to carry the franchise into its next era, bringing with them the kind of talent and charisma that suggested the Yankees' greatest days might still lie ahead. Judge, in particular, captured the imagination of fans with his combination of power, size, and humble personality, becoming the kind of player around whom championships are built. The pursuit of the next championship continues, as it always has, as it always will. The Yankees remain committed to their history while embracing the future, honoring their past while writing new chapters in the ongoing story of the most successful franchise in professional sports. And so we return to where we began, to that quiet space between seasons where stories take shape and legends are born. The Yankees' history is not just a collection of statistics and achievements. It is a testament to the possibility of sustained excellence, to the power of institutional memory, to the way that individual brilliance can be channeled into collective greatness. From Ruth's towering home runs to Jeter's clutch hits, from Gehrig's quiet dignity to Rivera's calm dominance, from the house that Ruth built to the cathedral that stands today. The Yankees have provided us with moments that transcend sports and become part of the larger American narrative. Their story is still being written, still unfolding in ways that we cannot yet imagine. But one thing remains constant: the expectation of excellence, the pursuit of championships, the understanding that wearing pinstripes means being part of something larger than yourself, something that connects you to every player who has worn the uniform, every fan who has cheered in the stadium, every moment of triumph and heartbreak that has defined this remarkable franchise. The ghosts of the stadium are always with us, reminding us of what was and inspiring us toward what might be. In the quiet moments before the game begins, in the tension of a close pitch, in the explosion of joy that follows a championship victory, we can feel their presence. Ruth and Gehrig, DiMaggio and Mantle, Rivera and Jeter, all part of the continuing story of the New York Yankees. This is their legacy. This is their gift to us. The understanding that greatness is possible, that excellence can be sustained, that some institutions can transcend their time and place to become eternal symbols of human achievement. The Yankees are more than a baseball team. They are a reminder of what we can accomplish when we refuse to accept anything less than our best. When we understand that the pursuit of excellence is not just a goal, but a way of life. The story continues, as all great stories do, without ending, always reaching toward new heights, new achievements, new moments of magic that will add to the legend and inspire future generations to carry on the tradition. In the cathedral of memory that is Yankee Stadium, surrounded by the ghosts of greatness, the game goes on, and the pursuit of perfection continues, one pitch at a time, one game at a time, one season at a time, forever and always, world without end.